Is Azeroth getting revamped? Everybody seems to think so. Everybody on YouTube, on my homepage, every recommended video, it's just like, is Azeroth getting revamped? Maybe. That's what I want to talk about today. Hello everybody, it's me Crendor, and welcome back to Crendor Talks in front of a shitty green screen. So today we are going to be talking about why this should happen, how it could happen, and pretty much the pros and cons of, I think, a lot of it. So why should it happen? Why should we revamp Azeroth? I think the main reason would be that the old world is a mess. Because when we go back to the old world, whether it's for leveling or just old quests or farming stuff, you see how just discombobulated everything is, right? Even in Cataclysm, you had to take portals everywhere. You know, some things were just completely revamped, others were just completely left alone, right? There's just, it's this weird, like, amalgamation of just old and new, and things have just been broken for so long, right? Like, Cataclysm destroyed everything, and so things have been destroyed for just 12 years at this point. And it's gotten to the point where people are so used to that being Azeroth, like especially a new player. Like, you come into the game and you're like, wow, this is how Azeroth is. And up until classic WoW, you know, you weren't even able to go back and visit old Azeroth. And so now that I think people have been able to do that, now that, you know, we are so long removed from Cataclysm, I think it finally is time to just move on from Cataclysm, right? It feels right, especially with the 20th anniversary coming up. Like, what a perfect time. You got the big 20th anniversary of World of Warcraft and be like, guys, we're going back. We're going back to the Eastern Kingdoms, Kalimdor, and we are finally going to revamp a lot of old Azeroth. Now, how could it happen, right? Because everyone's like, oh, well, this is like a big project, and it is a very big project. But I think we have seen over time, Blizzard's been adding in little bits and pieces here and there. And that's the big reason a lot of people have been saying it's going to happen, right? There's a lot of old buildings and models that are slowly updating over time. I mean, you can look at Arathi Highlands or Darkshore, right? Arathi Highlands is a perfect example where they've redone a lot of the castle structures. They've done a lot of, you know, new modeling updates, and that's just one zone. But, you know, when you slowly start doing one zone here, one zone there, you know, you can reuse those assets, because let's face it, assets are going to get reused. It happens in every video game, but I mean, you know, even in classic WoW, plenty of stuff gets reused, right? Or just throughout the history of World of Warcraft. So that's not a big deal to me. I think the biggest thing is what they're going to do with the world. So first thing I want to cover is the new player experience, because right now leveling in World of Warcraft, at least from the start, is just really weird and bad. Right? Like, there's Exile's Reach, which when I first played through it, I was like, you know what, this is pretty fun, it's cool, but it almost handholds you a little too much and then there's some points where it feels like it doesn't tell you enough. Like, it's okay. But I think a lot of people just want to go to their main area, right? If you're an orc, you go to the orc area. If you're an undead, you go to the undead area, and just play through a little story that teaches you about the faction that you've chosen to play, about, you know, who's in charge, the main story. And I think that's one of the biggest things that's gotten removed from the game is, you know, when you make a character, you're kind of removed from the story. Let's say you finish Exile's Reach, right? You're like, oh man, all right, time to go play World of Warcraft. And then they're like, well, which expansion you want to go to? And you're just like, what? Like, if you're a new player, you're like, what do you mean, which expansion? I guess the new one? And they're like, no, you can't do that yet. Can't do that. You gotta pick one of the old ones to level through. And then you're like, oh, what about the base game, I guess? Cataclysm. Wait, that's not the Wrath. And then you go to Cataclysm or Wrath or any of these expansions. You're like, okay, I'm playing through it. This is fun. And you either smash through the levels so fast that you don't even get to experience the story you picked to play through, or you just get shoved into, like, you know, you're playing through one story and then it's like, all right, you're max level, go do the new stuff. And you're like, but I'm invested in this old expansion now, right? And they're like, doesn't matter, get out. Right? And it feels like everything just needs to be revitalized, to be, you know, made anew. And I think that kind of carries over from Cataclysm, because in Cataclysm, we destroyed Azeroth, right? Azeroth got destroyed, buildings blown up, you know, ground burned, things decimated, and now we can do the opposite, right? Like we can go back and we can rebuild Azeroth. We can, you know, everything can be more green and more fresh and more revitalized, you know, and like even looking at the new Arathi Highlands, I think is a perfect example of how it could be, right? And that's why I'm actually interested in something upcoming, which is dragon riding being introduced in Azeroth. And I think that's one of the things that piqued my interest, because them testing dragon riding in Azeroth to me almost feels like a little bit of a beta test. Like, let's see how this could work in Azeroth if we carried over dragon riding. You know what I mean? Now that could just be them, you know, just playing around, being like, let's just try it. But to me, it's pretty interesting for them to actually put dragon riding into Azeroth and be like, let's test it out. Like, especially with all the rumors, like that's pretty telling to me. But again, it could just be a completely random thing. Like you start pinning all the meme with the board, putting everything together, but then it ends up being something completely different. So that's a whole thing. But that also got me reading a bunch of posts and, you know, other videos and seeing stuff. And I saw one that thought of a mega zone theory, which was combining a bunch of subzones into big mega zones, almost like how Dragonflight is, where you have like a big zone and then maybe you have subzones within that big zone, which I guess would be better for things like dragon riding or like overarching stories. But I don't know. It feels like everything's a little too spread out still. So I'm kind of curious how they would go about doing that, because I don't think we're going to get a Cataclysm tier revamp, because it feels like going from zone to zone to zone to zone. Like they're not going to do like, we redo Feralus and now we redo Tanaris. And it almost does feel like they would have to go into a big zone style of like leveling or design or whatever it might be, right? Where maybe Tanaris and Feralus and all these things are clumped together, Thousand Needles, and they just have one big overarching story where you have like things here and there and you go, but you would still have to like redo the zones. And that's why this is like such a crazy thing for me, because I really do want to see what they would do if they revamped Azeroth, because this is such a massive project, you know, like going through all these zones is a lot. But at the same time, we've seen in Dragon Isles how Dragon Isles, they've said, is like just this massive continent compared to a lot of older zones, and flying over Dragon Isles is like huge. So they've gotten better at designing and working with really big continents and areas, which makes me think like maybe they could do something like that, right? Maybe they would remove stuff in order to simplify things, right? Like maybe there's so many things you can do in Feralus, so many things you do in Tanaris, but you just kind of revamp it and restyle it to the point where it's like, you know, you got a few hubs and then a lot of the areas are more open. That's one thing I thought of, but then people would probably be like, there's too much open space. So I don't know if you can win with that either. But one way you can win is through the channel sponsor, Zygor. Zygor is fantastic for leveling guides, mount farming, pet collecting, whole bunch of stuff. They've got it all. If you want to check it out, you can use the link in the description. And if you want to upgrade to an elite subscription, use code Crendor for 20% off. I actually just did all the Midsummer Fire Festival stuff using Zygor, and it was very nice to use and very convenient. So check it out. Use code Crendor for 20% off. And that brings me to my other theory I thought of when I was just like, you know what? How would they do this? How would they revamp all these different zones and do all this stuff? As you can see, I also changed to the revamped Warsong Gulch, which they would probably use some of those assets as well. And that was, they would get rid of the zones that we know currently. And this would probably send a bunch of people into a frenzy of like, oh my God. But I feel like it's something that actually could happen. So imagine if you take Tanaris and Feralus and Thousand Needles and the Barrens, right? And you just kind of scrap all of it, right? And you just kind of, you know, map it out as one big zone, right? And you just call it like Southern Kalimdor. And you put like, okay, this is where the Barrens was. This is where, you know, Tanaris is. This is where Feralus is. And you would map out the main points, right? Like, okay, you have Ratchet here. And, you know, you have Thousand Needles, the Great Lift right here, right? And you kind of put all those things, but then you build around it and say, how would an Azeroth revamp 12 years after, well, I guess, you know, actual 12 years, but like however many years in World of Warcraft, how would the environment change? How would the environment heal? What are some things that are going to happen in the lore, you know, with elements and everything? So there's a whole thing where they're like, what was the elements in Dragonflight are like, they're waking up, right? The world is waking up. That was a quote they said. The dragons return home. And so how would those things impact the world, right? You know, is everything going to start growing? Are different elements and elemental things going to impact, you know, Dustwallow Marsh? Is it going to be a marsh anymore if some crazy stuff happens, right? It's, you know, the equivalent of how Thousand Needles became flooded in Cataclysm. Like, what's going to happen now? Is it still flooded? Maybe that area is kind of drained out water. You know, they would revamp that. And, you know, it doesn't have to be its own zone anymore. It would just be part of Southern Kalimdor. And they would essentially start from the drawing board and just revamp all of it with all the, you know, updated assets and everything like that. And I think that would be the maybe easiest way. Listen, I'm not a game developer, right? If you couldn't tell. But, you know, because people are like, oh, what about Ghostlands? Well, instead of having Ghostlands at the top of Eastern Kingdoms and then, you know, the Eversong or the Blood Elf land, right? You can now just take all that and just kind of rebuild the whole thing with new assets and new things. And I don't know how this might be too big of a project, but I feel like if you're going to revamp everything, you may as well just kind of start from scratch. But you're not really starting from scratch, right? You still have a foundation to work with. You have a map to work with. You've got new assets you've been slowly implementing over time to work with. And I think that's probably the most realistic way to do it, because I don't think you could go zone by zone and do it the same way it currently is. Like, I feel like you would have to make it more like Dragon Isles, and that's how I see it happening. So let me know what you think down in the comments section below. How do you think they will revamp Azeroth, if they will actually revamp Azeroth? And let me know down there. So like, comment, subscribe. Thanks for watching my random opinion video. And go check out some pointless top 10s right up here. We just had pointless top 10 weirdest NPCs in World of Warcraft. We also had turtles, boars, houses, elevators. There's a whole bunch of them. Go check them all out. And thank you again to the channel sponsor, Zygor. Use code Crendor for 20% off an elite subscription. Okay? Okay. See ya.